Okay, so this is our first part of our video lectures on family and adolescent psychology. We started some of this in class, but we're going to continue this as a cohesive unit so that you have access to it online. Um, it might seem a little bit strange to talking about a whole unit on the family for adolescent psychology. It seems better situated for childhood psychology, where in childhood the family is a critical crucible for development. The child is more dependent upon their parents and the rest of their family, and shapes kind of their view of the world. Adolescents are kind of moving out of the family into creating their own families, and so it seems maybe not as well placed. But still, there's things going on as the transition occurs that I think are critical to how adolescents are seeing themselves, and the family still has a huge influence on, let's say, how they see themselves and what they become during this period. So let's start with an overview. In this lecture, we're going to look at why the family is important to understanding adolescent psychology in general. Secondly, we're going to look at how the family unit has changed historically to provide some context on this. And lastly, we're going to look at how relationships inside the family with children with parents, these interfamily dynamics evolve during adolescence. Because it's not just the adolescent in isolation. Because people tend to have children at a particular age, when children are reaching adolescence, most of the parents are, let's say, reaching their midlife period, and therefore they're changing. They're not static either. There's a dynamic for the members in the family, and so the point is the adolescent isn't the only developing or moving piece. There are other moving pieces, and this creates certain dynamics for what is typical for a lot of adolescents' experience at this stage of their life. So let's begin. So we're going to start with talking about some of the historical changes. There are three major changes over the past 2 centuries that have influenced family life. The first one is lower birth rate. In 1800, American women had an average of 8 children. If you look at even before this time, if you look at old gravestones in the Northeast, what you'll often find is a headstone with a father and a mother, usually several different mothers because many women died in childbirth, and something like on the order of 15 to 20 children. The thing is that many of these children died young, and therefore you had to have a lot of children to sustain the size of the family, make sure at least some of them survive to adulthood. The average number for children today is around 2. And just to illustrate with my own family is that my mother was one of 8 children, I am one of 5 children, and I have 2 children. And so what you're seeing, even in the same family, the same background, same set of values, what you're seeing is smaller and smaller families over time. The second thing is longer life expectancy, and this is sort of related. Up until 1900, the average life expectancy was about 45. Now, this is a little bit deceptive because it doesn't really mean that people died in their 30s and 40s. What it probably suggested is that there were a lot of high levels of infant mortality, and therefore there are a lot of births died before the age of 1, and that brought down the average life expectancy. If you look at this in a better way, looking at what is life expectancy at age 5, once you had passed that critical period, a lot of people actually live longer. But how does it affect adolescence is that if you think of the average life expectancy as 45 years old, it means when children are reaching adolescence, their parents are, let's say, in the last stage of their life. And that's very different than today, where we expect parents to live old enough to become grandparents and see the children of their children. Now you see the average life expectancy is over 70. So I'm going to take a step back and just explain what's going on driving this trend. And demographers call this a demographic transition. As countries develop, this demographic transition is kind of what is the relationship between birth rates and death rates over time. In traditional societies and in modern societies, you see a relatively stable overall population. In traditional societies, because you have a stability because you have high death rates, but they're balanced out by high birth rates. In modern societies, you have low death rates, but you also have relatively low birth rates, and that's also stable. So what happens, let's say early modern, let's say maybe for European context, 1800s, people don't live very long. Medicine wasn't very good. Public health wasn't very good. Sanitation wasn't very good. There were a lot of things that could kill you. However, to balance this out, what you seem to have is that women focused on raising children and generally had, double-digit numbers of children, and very many women died in childbirth because it wasn't particularly sanitary and wasn't particularly safe. So relatively small societies. What happens, let's say, as public health is developing in the 1800s. You get better sanitation, better, cleaner water, better nutrition. What happens is that the death rate drops because for a lot of different reasons, people can live longer because they're living in a healthier time. But they're still maintaining high birth rates because they think that, people are going to die young because no one knows how many years they're going to live. And so the birth rate continues to be high for an extended period of time. And this is generally where you see a population explosion in society because you get very low death rates and very high birth rates. And what you have, and this is kind of important for adolescent psychology, is large young generations, where in many developing countries, 2/3 of the population is like under 20 years old. It's the majority of the overall population because a relatively few people live to be adulthood, but more and more young people are surviving and entering that generation. And so the overall population pyramid looks like kind of like looks like a pyramid with a wide base and a narrow top. Ultimately, what generally happens is the birth rate comes down. And this is because people realize that they're not going to die. They don't feel the need to have as many children. And they do a lot of things to restrict the number of children they're going to have. It could be having children at a later age, delaying marriage. It could be contraception. A lot of other things going on in this period. But basically, you see the birth rate decline. And then in the mature stage, like we are today in the United States, you see low birth rates and low death rates. So just kind of to summarize what I just said, in poor societies, you tend to have high birth and death rates. Poor could also be traditional societies. All societies kind of were at this level of development, at least at one stage. Life expectancy is low, infant mortality is high, and birth rates have to stay high because of the low life expectancy and high levels of infant mortality. There's always a lag because death rates, we don't know that death rates are decreasing until after they happen. And that leads to this population explosion in kind of a youthful society that can have an outsized impact on the overall society. And as countries mature, you see birth rates decrease and population stabilizes once again. Now, the other thing that's going on here is what the technical term is the female participation in the labor force. So what that means is that women kind of face a choice between work and children, which means if women are working in the outside the home, earning, having an income outside the home, they're not focusing on raising children, and they're probably not having as many children. And what this is called is an M curve. And the reason why it's called an M curve is that the shape of female participation, if you track it over the different age groups, is that you'll see it relatively high in the late teens, early 20s. It declined in the late 20s, early 30s as they leave the workforce to have children. It goes back up again when they return to, as their children have grown up, they return to the workforce, and then ultimately, the last leg, it goes down again as they retire. So as the age of childbearing rises, the number of children declines. So what happens is a lot of things that have fewer children is that they might get married later, they might have their first child at a later age. The past pattern would have been people having children in their late teens, early 20s. The average today is more late 20s, early 30s, and some late 30s, even 40s, has become much more common. Because you're starting later, you're going to have fewer children because the window of fertility is like shorter, and therefore you can't, even if you're having children all the time after you start, there's not as much time and therefore fewer children. So this is kind of a graph that shows you a comparison of several different nations. And just to point two out, the blue line shows the United States in 1994. It's not much of an M. There you can kind of see a little dent around the age in the 30s as women are leaving the workforce, but it's not that pronounced. If you look at a more traditional society at the same time, Japan, it goes up, it decreases markedly in the 30s and 40s. You see the return in the 40s and 50s, and then the decline associated with retirement. And this is just one more way of looking at it. This is showing what's happened over time. So in 1890, you can see women worked a little bit in the 20s. They left the workforce, and they basically stayed out of the workforce. And even at its peak, it wasn't, let's say, a high percentage of women employed. But over time, you can see the M curve shape for the 1950s and 1970s. But by the 1990s, there's really no M at all. It's like an inverted U. Women join the workforce. They rarely leave. And as a result, you're going to see, thing we're going to help before about, more two-income families, but also more female-headed households where women are earners as well as, let's say, involved in child rearing. So these are the two changes. The third change is kind of a movement from rural to urban, which means in the 1800s, most of the people were working in agriculture, most of them were farmers. Farm families needed more children because children were workers on the farm. As agriculture has become more mechanized and developed and modernized, you need less people to raise the same amount of food, and so you're seeing the farm population shrink, and therefore the pressure to have more children has decreased. So the number of people who are farmers today is, a small single-digit percentage of the total population. Initially, this population went from the farm to the factory, and now you're seeing people going from the factory to the service sector, is the pattern. So just to kind of show you where kind of families are, this shows you, for example, three population pyramids. Sandy, Utah, which is a suburb, Washington, D.C., which is a city, and Miami Beach, kind of an elderly retirement. And if you look across the top, you can see the median age being different. So Sandy, Utah would be kind of what you typically would find in the suburbs, is you kind of see this double onion shape to the population pyramid. You see a lot of people in their teenage years and a lot of people in their 40s, late 30s, 40s, even really to late 40s. And so what do you see in the suburbs? You see a lot of parents and a lot of children. And so you don't see a lot of, let's say, 20-somethings, because most of those people are going to be going elsewhere. They're in college. They're single people. Generally, they're not going to be living in the suburbs. If you look at Washington, D.C., you kind of see where those 20-somethings are. The bulge here is in the 20s. People go single, live in a bright, exciting city, more dating opportunities, more chances to meet people. And you don't see certainly you don't see a lot of children, which means you don't see a lot of teenagers as much in the cities relative to the population as a whole, and you see relatively fewer elderly people. If you look, let's say, a retirement community like Florida, what you're seeing is it's kind of an inverted pyramid. You see a lot of people in the upper years, 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. Almost no, fewer children than even, let's say, an urban environment. Some people in their 20s and 30s, but probably a lot of those people are employed by taking care of the elderly. And so there's kind of a geographical distribution of households and families. But the first one in Sandy, Utah, kind of points out something we'll make later, which is that adolescence, you see where a lot of 10 to 19-year-olds are, is usually associated with a lot of people in their 30s and 40s. And so we'll talk about, let's say, the matching of adolescence with parental midlife crises and how that leads into family dynamics. So several other changes about, let's say, the quality, or not so much that families are static and the number of families, the number of children have changed, but families are not the same thing as they used to be. The first one is a higher divorce rate. A lot of this is because of the rise of what's called no-fault divorce, which means in the past, to get divorced, you had to give a reason. So something like mental cruelty, even when it was amicable breakup, would have to be cited in the legal documents. Most states in the United States have made divorce easier to obtain, and as a result, divorce rates are higher. I believe the rate is that about half marriages end in divorce, so about 50%. Kind of related to this is that you're going to see a lot more single-parent households. The first one is that mothers are about 90% of the custodial parents, which means when the divorce happens, the children stay with the mother. They're going to be primarily raised by the mother, and as we talked before, women are working more, so they're able to support their children in a way they wouldn't have in the past. But you're also seeing situations where the father is out of the home, or therefore not present, and therefore not there during adolescence, or at least not there in a constant way. So two things. First of all, you might see an absence of a father figure in the household, but you might see also more likely to have stepchildren and step-parents. And that's going to change the family dynamic because you're going to have different groups of children in the same household, but you also might have someone in a parental role who is not the biological parent. And this is becoming much more common. Lastly, sort of related to what I was saying before, employment among women is increased. And what's happened is that you don't see women leaving the workforce to help raise children. And as a result, you saw with that M curve is that women are participating and staying there, and so children are increasingly raising themselves, particularly since the 1980s, and the rise of what they call latchkey children, children who would had a key and would let themselves home. Less adult supervision leads to a very different adolescence than it would have been in the past. So change in the family. So fewer than 15% of today's teenagers live in a household that you might call as like an Ozzie and Harriet 1950s household where both biological parents are in the household and the father is the only one earning. So you're seeing a lot of different changes. So the number of siblings has changed. The rise of only children has risen. Family income is different, meaning that it comes both from the father and the mother increasingly. The age of the parents has changed because when people have started to have children, has moved back. And the absence of a stay-at-home mom is not as common now as it was in the past. So high rates of divorce and high rates of childbirth outside of marriage mean majority of adolescents born in the 1990s are going to spend some of their childhood or adolescence in a single-parent household. This doesn't necessarily mean that they are damaged or there's anything wrong with that. It just means that it's going to be different, and therefore what the old model of adolescence might not hold going forward. So half of teens whose parents divorce will spend time in a step family, which means you might have an adult figure who's not your you don't have a relationship with through childhood, who's not your biological parent, and therefore the challenge to parental authority during adolescence can be quite different because it's harder to assert, and also there might not be the family bond among the members of the household. So another thing is the family is changing, that if we go back and look at the family in the 1800s, is the family was kind of the core social unit of your entire life. In a time when you were a farmer, you did not go to school because you didn't need to learn, let's say, the type of skills you learned in the classroom. You learned your skills by more or less emulating and copying your parents. If your parents were farmers, you were going to become a farmer. How did you learn to become a farmer? You watched your parents. If your father was a crafts person, and I'm saying father because generally it's going to be the father who is in the occupational role, you're just going to follow the role that your father has. And if you're a female, you're going to follow your mother probably is going to educate you how to raise your children, how to make clothing, and other types of things around the household. The family had a religious role that people associate their parents with God, and they wouldn't have necessarily been centered in, let's say, a church or a synagogue or some other house of worship. So you see like the specialization of religious roles more so than in the past. Medical, family home remedies, which more common. In the 1930s, you could get into medical school basically with high school chemistry as your background. It wasn't as specialized, and nor was it necessarily that effective. Your family is the one who cared for you, whether you were delivering a child or if you were sick. You probably didn't go to a hospital, or if you did go to a hospital, it was mostly to go to the hospital to die, not to recover. And you're seeing that move out of, let's say, from the family into the medical profession. You work on a farm, your family is not just, let's say, where you get your meals and where you sleep. Your parents are probably your employer. And so you can imagine if, let's say, you have a teenage job, usually you're working for someone else. You have a different authority figure. Your employers are not your parents, and I think a lot of you can imagine what it'd be like if your employer were your parents. Recreation happened in the home where people would read a book or listen to the radio, and now you're more likely to go outside on your device, go to a movie, go to a live event, and so entertainment no longer really centers on the family. The only thing that stayed constant is the family is still the center of what you may call your affections, which means the assertion that family is first and your family has to accept you and your family likes you and supports you, and that you feel kind of safe in the family. So the family has been stripped away of all these other functions over time as we entered a more modern society, but still our affections are kind of still centered on the family unit. So extended family relationships. In traditional cultures, what you're going to see is that young men generally remain in their family home after marriage, and young women move into a new husband's home. Now, this is not 100% what even back then, but this is maybe, let's say, the pattern, the idealized pattern. This might, for a reason, especially when there wasn't any, let's say, Social Security or old income pensions and things of that sort, families were really happy that they had young boys as opposed to young girls, because your boy would stay in the household and continue to support you after you were unable to work, while a young a woman who basically the whole idea of like wedding presents is the idea that you have to pay someone to take your young daughter off your hands and then take responsibility for providing. Um, so this has changed, and one thing that I read recently in Asia where you used to have very strong like male-child preferences among parents is that in Japan and Korea, what you see is actually a preference for girls over boys today because the idea is that boys are not reliable, but women are very good at taking care of their elderly parents, and therefore almost a preference for girls over boys. Um, so even though this pattern might have been typical in India and China and other in Asia, it's not as true as it used to be. And you're seeing it changing, and you're seeing kind of China following the pattern of Korea and Japan as it modernizes. Is that the one thing that's happening in China is that for a long time you had the one child policy, and as a result you have several generations now of people who do not have siblings and don't have aunts or uncles, and as a result they don't really have the extended relationships, even though they might be kind of in transitioning from a traditional to a modern kind of social level. Um, so what happens is that in American, sometimes what you might see is multi-generational households where grandparents and aunts and uncles, sometimes you will see as like a family compound. And some of my in-laws are from the Philippines, and in their traditional house in the Philippines, they have like a walled compound, and in it you might have a variety of family homes, which means you might have your aunt lives next door to you and across the street, and then all the other aunts and uncles. And so you grow up with your cousins and also kind of under the supervision of your grandparents. And this, so the point is that you have multiple, let's say, adult models beyond just your parents. And just parenthetically, even though now they live in the United States, my brother and my in-laws literally live across the street from her sister. And so and you could say it's kind of that notion that there is a extended family model in certain types of cultures that extends even when the geographic location changes. American majority culture, and majority just means uh, it's not saying majority is better or the normal or average. It's just saying that kind of, let's say, this idealized 1950s Ozzie and Harriet family, which is going to be white European background. You see less contact historically with extended family members, which means the typical household is two parents and children. Grandparents live separately, aunts and uncles live separately, and therefore you have less contact. Now, we talked about this in class, and I think what we said is that that's not the pattern. And one thing we've seen over the last 20 and 30 years is like adult children moving back in with their parents, but also you're seeing as the family has become more diverse, is that you're seeing extended family and step families and a variety of different, let's say, organizations to the family household unit. Um, and so sometimes with divorce families, divorce is sometimes meant that children, as let's say the adults and the parents are dating again and forming new relationships, and maybe it's in flux and transition, you might see more people raised by their grandparents than you would have seen in the past. And certainly this is the case among some people. So what's happening in adolescent families is that you're seeing a renegotiation of power and responsibility. Basically, adolescents are proto-adults. Particularly in the modern American family, you're seeing adolescents, teenagers working, having their own income, having the ability to drive, having, let's say, relationships and organizations that don't include time with the family. And what this is coinciding with is the parental midlife crisis. So you're reaching your late teens, early 20s at a time when your parents are reaching their 40s and 50s, where your body, and I can attest this as someone in their 40s, your body starts to break down, your hair goes gray, gravity takes over different parts of your body, you can't work as hard, and you're not feeling as powerful. It affects your mental outlook on yourself as well. At the same time, your children are kind of reaching the prime of your life. And so you might say, as the possibilities are increasing for adolescents, the whole world is wide open to them. They're finally able to make decisions and choices on their own. What you're seeing among the parents and the adults is that they're kind of seeing the window closing, which means they've reached kind of the position they're going to be for their life. They've more or less, that's what they've done. That's their career. And sometimes that can be disappointing. And so these are coinciding at the same time, leading to, let's say, maybe a crisis or a struggle as power and responsibilities are renegotiated in the family. Um, so some other things are going on as children kind of enter and then go through adolescence. There's changes in the family as a whole unit, which means you might see elder siblings leave the family, going to college or going to work, living separately from their parents. And so the point is the family unit might be becoming smaller. You're going to see some changes in economic circumstances. So particularly the cost of college is a big thing that you know uh, how are we going to pay for college? And very often, some parents have saved a long time for their children, and other times it's like, well, if you want to go to college, we paid for high school through taxes. College is your expenditures, and therefore, all of a sudden, kids who've had maybe perhaps having a lot provided for them are all of a sudden like, well, now you have to go provide on yourself, and we're not providing free rent and board and paying for your education anymore. Another thing is that peers are becoming much more important than members of the family, which means that in adolescence, usually the most important group to you is not your family, it's your peer group or your group of friends. And so people take cues from their friends about what is normal, what's acceptable. They're more likely to ask their peers about things like sex and drugs and relationships and all that, and less likely to ask their parents. They're not, it's not just that like they are ashamed or don't want to hide it from their parents, is that they don't trust their parents as much as their, let's say, their adolescent peers. So it's not as clear as that the children are as dependent upon the parents as it would be in childhood or infancy. Some other transformations. What you're seeing is an asymmetric relationship where parents have a lot of power and children have very little power, to more of an equal relationship, which means adolescents might have their own income, they might have their own vehicle, they might have the mental and cognitive ability to argue or to win arguments with their parents. Physically, they might be just as strong. There secondly is the role of puberty, which means a lot of things are changing. Hormones and their brain is going under change. We talked a little bit before about the adolescent brain. And this can throw a lot of, let's say, curveballs into the mix. And lastly, violations of expectations, which means is that everyone sort of has a role. Like, parents dress their kids up to a certain age, and now the child is deciding to dress for themselves, and maybe in ways that shock their parents. They might be choosing careers that it's not what the parents had in mind for them. And so a lot of those things are under kind of influx and transition during this time. Now, just to go a little back, something I mentioned before about kind of what's going on with the parents, because it's not like the parents are static either. So they might be increased concerned. They might not be attractive. They might be worried about their sex appeal. And if you've seen the movie Mean Girls, where the mother of the head plastic is trying to be kind of a teenager and dressing like the teenagers, and I think this is not just for comedy, but you might sometimes see more mild versions of this in real life. Midlife crisis, which means older people are behaving kind of like they're trying to recapture their youth in their 1920s while they still have some. And so they might be behaving less mature than they were, let's say, previously. And this can affect the mental health of parents. You might see some more depression. You might see some hormonal changes as women enter menopause and things of that sort. And therefore, the parent who's been such an anchor or a source of stability for children is in flux. And why this is particularly important for adolescents is that they're becoming adults, and these parents are their primary kind of role model about what they're supposed to be. And instead of, let's say, having a clear, defined parental, let's say, model, the parental model is in transition itself. The adult model is in transition, so it can lead to instability in what they're supposed to model themselves on. So some gender differences in the family. Sons and daughters, what you see is that sons and daughters in family relationship, there's similar degrees of how close you are to your parents, what types of rules, patterns of activities. The gender of the parent, which I guess what this is saying is that parents treat the children it doesn't matter if you're a male or female of your child, but the gender of the parent um, might be more important than the gender of the teenager or the adolescent. So teens tend to be closer to the mothers and have a much more intense relationship and attachment, whether they're male or female. The fathers, what you might see is the fathers rely upon the mothers for information, but the father is kind of a distant authority figure. So, stereotypically what this means is that the mother decides like whether you get permission or whether you get punished or things of that sort. And then the father comes home from work and basically says, okay, your mother decided you can't go to this, I'm agreeing with her, and not having an independent relationship, or their relationship with the father is mediated through the mother, but the effective relationship is mostly with the mother for the teenagers. Um, Overall, and we'll talk more about this in the next video lecture, is that teenagers and adolescents seem to feel close to their parents and respect their parents' judgment. Where they tend to disagree is over what you might call mundane issues, which means they agree there have to be rules, but they're wondering what the rules are. So they might agree that there should be a curfew, but they think the curfew should be at a particular time. They might agree that, let's say, they shouldn't have full rule of the roost and full range of adult responsibilities, but they might want to kind of, let's say, negotiate where those borders and boundaries are. Some of it might be is the method of conflict resolution, which means like when there's a disagreement, what people tend to fight over is that adolescents might want to resolve the conflict in one way, or their sense of justice and what's right and wrong is different than what their parents are. But they seem to share similar about fundamental things, which means very often you share the political, social, religious, moral values that your parents have. Where you differ is maybe like, well, I like this type of dress and you don't. I like this type of leisure activity and you don't. So for example, like maybe older people want to go see a movie while younger people might stream it at home on a TV. So last thing here is that what you're seeing is less time spent together. So fifth graders spend about between a quarter and a third of their waking hours in their family, while 12th graders are spending something along the lines of what, 7th to 1/8 of their waking hours with their family. And here you can see it change and how much time is spent with the family. You see a big change from 5th to 6th grade, and that's elementary to middle school. You see kind of a plateau in the middle school, and then you see another kind of like leg down after 9th grade to 10th grade, where you see less time spent with the family group. Now, a lot of this, if you think about this, is that your parents are more likely to come to your recitals, rehearsals, sporting events when you're in elementary school. They're still pretty involved in middle school. A few weeks ago, I witnessed the Lakeland debate tournament, and we had a middle school level and then a high school level. And the middle school level, you saw all types of parents there watching their children debate. And it wasn't because necessarily the debate was better, but the point is that they seem to be more involved when it comes to the debates, even at a distance. And in the high school divisions, you saw almost no adults, no parents whatsoever. It's kind of like when you reach a certain level, the center of your social activities is going to be more with your peer groups and less, oriented around your parents. And this has changed. We'll talk a little bit more about this in the next video lecture, but for now we're going to just end here, and I'll see you next time.